Thessalonians chapter number 2, we're examining what I have described as a model of ministry that Paul has set forth for us. We have already observed 3 of these points, and Lord willing, we'll continue on here tonight. Paul's ministry was one, according to verse number 1, that was conducted with purpose. He did not simply enter in unto this in a blind way. He came in. It was a ministry, an entrance that he said was not in vain. Secondly, it was one that was continued through perseverance, even though they had encountered difficulties in Philippi and even had encountered a lot of contention while they were there in Thessalonica. Paul still continued to persevere. Thirdly, it was a ministry that was characterized by purity. Purity of message was one that was not of deceit or of uncleanness, nor was it in guile. A purity of motive, as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. Paul also had a purity of method, and you read in verses 5 and 6 that Paul did not in any way engage in methodology that could be deceptive in any way. He did not seek to cover things up with a cloak of covetousness. The idea would be that he would feign or cover up some sort of a desire that he had to be able to gain more. That's not why he ministered to people. We didn't seek glory, he says, of men in verse 6, neither of you nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. They had a position, and there were certain things that were very fitting for an apostle. Paul says we didn't claim those things. He'll deal more with that a little bit later on in chapter number 2. His method was pure. Everything about his ministry was one that was pure. Let's move on tonight to look at point number 4, and we see that it was one that was communicated with passion. There was a love that characterized Paul's ministry. Notice verses 7 and 8. Paul says, "But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because ye were dear unto us." The description of verse number 7 is one that is a very sharp contrast to what was stated back in verse number 6. In verse number 6, he says, we did not seek glory improperly from others. We determined that we would not be burdensome to you as apostles of Jesus Christ. Instead, we were gentle among you. And the idea is we demonstrated kindness. It's the same word that's used in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 24, where Paul told Timothy that the servant of the Lord must strive to be gentle unto all men. Paul says we treated you with kindness. The kindness is further defined, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. A mother who is nursing comforts and consoles that child. It's an image that expresses not only kindness, but one of compassion. There was a tenderness that characterized Paul's ministry. They were not hostile towards people in any way, nor did they treat them with a sense of indifference or a sense of a lack of compassion. They were compassionate. They were kind towards people. Thirdly, they had a heartfelt desire for their well-being. Notice verse 8, "So being affectionately desirous of you." We have a strong yearning, a strong longing for you, as a very tender affection. They weren't governed by a mere outward show of affection. Paul says, no, we're sincere, and what we feel towards you is a heartfelt sincerity. The motivation that drives Paul was not something that was just external. It was motivated by a deep and heartfelt and internal desire that says, I want to see you guys do well. And this was the compassion that's there. Noticing that, then, they were willing to invest themselves entirely in the lives of the Thessalonians. He says, so being affectionately desirous of you, having this longing for you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because you were dear unto us. The word willing suggests more than just simply a desire. We might sometimes describe our children as maybe being willing to do certain chores or certain tasks that they're asked to do. But oftentimes their willingness, quote unquote, is not exactly what we're wanting. We're hoping for a little bit more than just this outward aspect of it. The word suggests that Paul had looked at the decisions and what he considered to be good and worthy of choice was that he would invest themselves into this. It was a conscious decision, we might say, that Paul then acted on that decision. I think it's important for us to realize that often we get, let's say, hung up on moving from ideas to reality. You're going to hear this a lot in our study in Thessalonians. It's a lot where the Lord has been working in my heart. It's a lot where I believe as a church we need to step out and go a different direction in that regard and look to intentionally invest in people. I hear lots of good ideas from time to time. There are good ideas that I hear in my job at Young. Somebody may have an idea of where to eat or where to stop, but sometimes those ideas never become reality. Sometimes those ideas are not capable of being reality. Certain teams like bagels, for example, to eat before they have their runs. Well, you know, most bagel places are not fitting with a 45-foot-long motor coach. We don't pull through Starbucks well, okay? It just doesn't fit that way. It might be a good idea, but the reality of it is going to be something that's vastly different. I think oftentimes we can sit down and create a list of ideas, and to be quite honest with you, I think it's important that we do so. And even this last Sunday, we had opportunity to list some what I thought were some very good ideas, but we have to move those ideas into reality, because an idea really doesn't cost me anything. It's no investment for me to sit down and take a sheet of paper and an ink pen and write down some ideas of something we could do. Oh, we could do this and we could do that and we could do this. It costs me very little. It costs me a sheet of paper and just a small amount of ink to be able to do so. But to go and put that into reality, that starts to cost something. Paul says, we looked at this, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls. We looked at it and we considered this as a choice, and we said, you know what, we will invest our souls, we will impart our souls unto you. Ministry is intentional. It does not occur by accident. It is the result of a conscious decision that an individual makes that says, I am going to do what I can to effect change. It's the whole premise behind it. And what they determined to do is invest themselves in the lives of these individuals. The word imparted suggests that they wanted to give a part of, or they wanted to share. And when Paul says we didn't limit exclusively to sharing the gospel of God, the gospel that belongs to God, the good news of salvation. Now, did they share that gospel? Yes. But it didn't stop there. We didn't stop, says Paul, with just sharing the gospel news. What we did was we were willing to impart our own souls. The term suggests our entirety, everything about us was consumed. We wanted to invest ourselves and establish these kinds of relationships. They gave themselves entirely to those who were in Thessalonica. I think this particular aspect is absolutely vital for us to implement. In addition to ministry being intentional, it has to be sacrificial as well. We invest our entire being into those to whom we minister. I have, throughout my years in ministry have had individuals say, well, we're going to leave the church, don't take it personally. Now, I don't know whether my dad was ever able to master not taking it personally, but I have not. You know why? My whole person is involved in it. It's not as though I could just, fine. Now, admittedly, there maybe have been some individuals where I thought to myself, don't worry, I will not take it personally. But those are few and far between. But, why? Because your whole person is involved in that. What about the ministry that God has put you in? It may be one person at work. It might be a handful in a Sunday school class. It might be a large crowd of people. But we'd best never conclude that ministering to a small group or even to one person is a waste of time. And sometimes that's how we feel. Well, I don't really think it's worth the effort. You know what Paul says? Paul says, I put my entire being, everything I had, I imparted it, I shared it with you. People are more precious than being viewed as a waste of time. When we allow that kind of mentality, whether it's in our ministry at church, whether it's in our lives at home or at work or whatever it might be, we've lost the sense of value that people are. Concluding that a small group of people or one person is not worth the time is a tragic error. Jesus paid the price for every individual to have eternal life. Every single one. Well, what if that means that this class has 1 or this class has 20? It doesn't matter. Because that one is the one that God brought into my life. And the one I have an opportunity to make a difference on. And if I say to that one, well, this just isn't worth it, what kind of a message does that convey to that one person? It certainly doesn't convey that they are of value. This kind of motivation comes from a heart of love. The phrase we use here was that of passion for those to whom we're ministering. I truly believe that sacrificial love is what reaches people. When you establish relationships and you begin to show and demonstrate how much you care, that's when relationships begin to build. Perhaps you've heard the saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. There's a tremendous amount of wisdom and insight in that. And so you might have one person that you just wish would take and do what you said. I remember in school, some classes were larger and some classes were smaller. And there were days where it felt like the small class, and there were times it was less than a handful, it seemed. It was a waste of time. But you know what I found when I had my attitude right? Those were some of the greatest opportunities that I had to make a positive difference in that person's life. Does that mean that every person who ever went through any of my classrooms has gone on and has done great things for the Lord? Nope, does not. But I'll tell you what, while I had them, I can honestly say I gave that everything I had to send them in a direction that was pleasing to the Lord. Who's God brought into your life? Are you valuing that? Are you willing to take the time and truly invest in them? The motivation behind this is stated at the end of verse 8. He says, because ye were dear unto us. It was a ministry that was motivated by love. These individuals had become, literally the word that's translated were, they had become dearly loved by Paul and Timothy and Silas. And that was what formed the basis of their ministry. You know how that love is achieved? Time. A lot of hard work. And there are times when it's seemingly successful, so supposedly, or seemingly appreciated. And there are times when it's not. But a ministry that is patterned biblically is one that is intentional. Paul says this was something we determined to do. It was sacrificial, and it's motivated by love. And sometimes our service becomes nothing more than a duty that's performed out of obligation. I have to. Nobody else will. And the lists go on. Probably shouldn't think so highly of yourself that nobody else will. The famous athlete on a football team, when he's carted off into the locker room, will find out that somebody else will. And the same crowd that was cheering for him 2 plays ago was now cheering for the guy that just took his place. Somebody else will. It's pretty arrogant to think that nobody else will, but sometimes in our moments, that's the way we get. When we perform things out of obligation or look at improper motives, what we'll find is that those kinds of things will lead very quickly to frustration. Often that frustration will be taken out on the people that we're ministering to. You ever notice on a bad day of work who you normally take it out on? Isn't it normally the ones closest to you? Bad day at work and it's the family that gets it. Well, what did they have to do with anything? Okay. The dog who really didn't have anything to do with it, he just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and it's frustration. Sometimes it leads to discouragement. Just feel as though nothing's going on, nothing good's going to happen. This is a waste of my time. Working with you is a waste of my time. Boy, we should never feel that way. It may also lead even to bitterness. Many lives, I think, have been derailed by that attitude right there. Our service should instead be motivated by our love for individuals, and the result of that is we'll treat them compassionately and not out of frustration. And when you're motivated properly and when you give yourself to these individuals, you give yourself to whoever it is, what you'll find is that you'll compassionately urge them to be like Christ. You won't lash out or give up on them when they don't meet your expectations. And sometimes we have that tendency. You're never going to amount to anything, or you're a waste of time or a waste of space or a waste of my life or whatever, and sometimes those statements hurt awfully deeply. Whether or not they amount to something is beyond my control, but I have to faithfully discharge what God's done for me. I think the pastors who determine it's best to remain distant from their congregation miss this very basic principle. I disagree with it entirely. You'll see my faults. I'd like to see you'd see my good things, but I'm not sure how many of those you actually see. But you stick around, you'll see my faults all the time. I'd rather you see that than for me to remain distant, because I think it's a wrong way of going about it. Who's God brought into your life? Who are you able to minister to? Let's do so effectively. And it might be 1, 2, 3, 20, 30, 100, it shouldn't matter. I ought to give my all for that one just as I would for that 100. My lesson ought to be prepared for 20 as effectively as it would for 200. It shouldn't matter. I know one pastor, and been a challenge to me as I've thought about things. Every now and then I get down in the dumps, and I've thought of this man a number of times. Much of his ministry has been to his family only. Been a very difficult struggle that he's endured. And some come and some go, but the ones that he preaches to week in and week out, by and large, were his family. It'd be tough to do week in and week out. We have opportunities to make a great change for the Lord. Let's have a ministry that's communicated with passion, one that the people love each other greatly. We don't have time to look at tonight, but we'll continue next week, Lord willing, and see one that was confirmed by practice. You know what? Paul's life was consistent with his message, and that's quite a challenge there as well. He was godly in his behavior, and he was godly in his ministry. Everything he did was centered around the Lord, and we'll see that in verses 9 through 12. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll look to take prayer.